How do I know that I exist? That's a classic philosophy question that I guess hasn't been answered by anyone to the majority of people's satisfaction. Otherwise, I wouldn't keep reading about it on the internet and in the news. When I grew up, I learned in school books that consciousness was a higher brain function, and that because mankind was able to evolve beyond living in trees or living in caves, that the ability to incorporate your own body, your own existence into feeding it and keeping it warm would create consciousness, would be a form of self-awareness that naturally occurred in the physical world, and explains why people are the most advanced animals, because they're the most aware, the most controlling of their environment, and that implies that consciousness is a like an idle activity can be given a name and studied, but is really simply the brain describing itself, noticing itself, your hands noticing that they're connected to the rest of you, and that the things you say in your mind end up moving your hands as you desire, and they can gather food or write a science paper, because your mind consciously is controlling your hands and the rest of you, and your mouth, your tongue, so that you can speak and say what's on your mind. That evidence of consciousness is usually explained in science by saying that our brain is able to make a model of reality that includes itself and the body. But I've found many problems with that way of thinking, and I've tried to come up with a simpler and simpler way of explaining to other people what my point of view is, and trying to prove, that is, make someone believe through a common sense argument that there is a better explanation for how consciousness occurs in the mechanical universe, without bringing in supernatural things like free will, ghosts, religion, spirituality in any of its forms, things that require faith, which means incorporating something that is invisible, that you can't really derive from first principles, that you know, and use is to explain something that you don't understand yet, rather than appeal to the supernatural, or to neuroscience, which says that a large enough and plastic or malleable enough, self-organizing enough set of electrical connections is also an explanation for how we can have self-awareness, how we can talk about or seem motivated to describe something we call ourselves, myself, or I. So I have approached this problem many ways, and as each new technique for explaining what I think to myself and to others comes up, I document it and have been building a repertoire of answers to common questions, and have been trying to achieve even closure that would be satisfying. Our existence, I think, can be assumed in trying to answer the question, how are we aware that we exist? I am not so much interested in figuring out why the universe exists, or if it's made of energy or pure consciousness or mathematically concrete axioms which would exist in nothingness, you could say, or that actually mean that nothingness is not as important as things that exist because they are truths or mathematical, concrete self-consistencies or tautologies. I'm not as interested in why does the universe exist, but I am interested in how do we know that we exist? Why are we aware that we exist and can say that we exist? I think that if we weren't aware, if a person wasn't aware, he couldn't talk about these topics, because a narration or a conversation is driven by its topic or its content. The words that wrap around the topic or content that take up the bulk of a narration are I think self-interacting energies, constructs, forms that through their self-interaction are self-sustaining, and that means last through a period of time, creating their own activity, exactly like an ecosystem. The Earth is an ecosystem that created us. It created individual animals and plants, and I think that is my recent interest, is that fact that the Earth's ecosystem is amazing in that it has built us from just water and dirt and air over a long period of time, admittedly, but it's still quite amazing that a person who can read and write and talk about science began as a fertilized egg cell, almost too small to see, and the sophisticated physics that obviously is needed to build a large skeleton that can speak through blowing air out its mouth and articulating that with its tongue, and can hear sounds around it, and think and reason and plan out activities, and then do those activities with muscles and bone and skeleton structure that if you think about it, is a very complicated puppet for any sort of puppeteer to have to fluently move around. And yet all that came from the physics of the earth. There was no supervision of, unless you believe in a God in the sky that looks down on the earth, who as just a minor task was able to have us grow from the beginnings of the earth, just a boiling hot sphere, but rather believe that the earth has not been tampered with since it began, and it cooled off, and the right ecosystem exists such that without supervision, but just as a self-sustaining, self-interacting, self-contained physical laboratory, we grew and can now ask questions like, how do we know that we exist? Well, my interest, as I said, is in these last few days is in thinking about the fact that self-awareness doesn't really mean, doesn't have to mean a self being aware of itself, or by analogy, the brain being able to describe itself as a brain, or the body being able to describe itself as a finite object, or as the Easterners say, as the observer observing the observer. Those types of pure awareness, the self being aware of itself, and asking what is that mechanism, that seems a little bit circular, in that saying observing the observer means you actually need to know what a telescope is, or a pad of paper and a pencil are, in order to go on to say that you can even think about observing the observer. One technique that I don't think is correct is called being radically dismissive of anything that has physical form. You use that physical form, that is your thoughts, your pencil and paper, and maybe a camera to record yourself talking, as you explain that those physical forms are not really needed to have the observer observe the observer. And I questioned that it's actually valid to say that you can start as a human form and figure out that a human form is just one type of conscious being, because the understanding of self-awareness might include more than just animals understanding that they themselves exist, and that thoughts are one way of explaining something, and that pure awareness uh, might be magical or dimensionless or in some way too mysterious for our human brain to understand. And to realize that that is possible, you could say something like, can we ever dispense with using thoughts as a way of making progress on something that might be spiritual or invisible or require faith? I have not ever been interested in that kind of thinking. What is the problem, though, is that how do you address something that is apparently a very difficult logical problem to comprehend, to grasp? So I was thinking that instead of saying that self-awareness means the self-observing itself, that you could back away a little bit from those demands, that rigor, or that model of consciousness and self-awareness. Instead, say that the self is something like an animal. It's a finite or a grouping of material that is, in our case, able to move around and talk about its life as it lives it. If that's what we really mean by a self, as defining it now as an individual, such as a person or an animal, or perhaps just indicating my body by hugging myself or describing myself as being from head to toe, a skeleton from my head to toe, and then separately define what I mean by awareness, then I wouldn't be quite just understanding awareness, but instead self-awareness, as I think some people insist. But it wouldn't be, like I said, in the form of the brain being aware of itself or the brain being aware of its bodies. Instead, the self means, in my latest thinking, as that which our ecosystem describes or creates through its genetic physics. So something like a bird hatching from an egg, which started out as, like we did, as a tiny egg cell and grew into an egg containing a flying machine, there needs to be a schematic or a description of the individual inside the egg. And that's clearly possible for our Earth's ecosystem to do, because there are countless species of animals, and a lot of them come from inside an egg. A bird ends up as a flying machine that can see and agilely avoid branches and land on branches and recognize food and predators. It can sing when it's happy and build a nest to complete its purpose in our ecosystem as an individual or a self. So the concept I'm trying to understand better is if our ecosystem describes individuals, if our ecosystem describes the self, and self-awareness is describing the self, then it could be that our ecosystem is conscious and not each individual person. To look at it from a different angle, I noticed that it's a good exercise to say that as I'm speaking about self-awareness, and that content, that topic is self-sustaining and is a activity that creates itself, that created itself, it's important to realize that that means that my consciousness and self-awareness are physical activities, just like talking and listening to myself talk are physical activities. The reason I can talk at length is about this topic is because I can hear myself speak, and I can hear that what I'm saying is progressing logically to be a complete discussion of the mechanism of self-awareness and consciousness. That's what I wanted to do, but in a physical mechanical world where I don't really choose by wanting to do something to do it, I am immersed in the actual physics, the actual nature that determines what I do and what my activities are. It's important to notice that the fact that I am talking about self-awareness and consciousness, and all my words have been sustaining themselves in order to continue that discussion. It means that it means the content of what I'm saying is also physical, being constructed from the physical world, my thoughts and what I'm saying and listening to what I'm saying, as well as creating the next thing that I am going to say. So the physical nature of my mind is that I am conscious. So describing myself is the mechanism of self-awareness, or the mechanism of talking about myself, that the fact that I'm an individual requires me to be self-aware and conscious, and so it must be that the cause and effect being self-interacting activities over a long narration discussion are one and the same. So to me that means that describing the individual, describing the self, is the mechanism of self-awareness. Describing the individual is self-awareness. And since that's what our ecosystem does, is make people, make animals, or describes them, and therefore they can exist. And that mechanism of describing individuals is self-awareness, then I think that the ecosystem, the Earth's ecosystem, is what is conscious. And that is how I would explain the mechanism of self-awareness.